All right, welcome back. On to chapter 4. This is the last of the new material for the first test. So obviously this chapter is variables of training. So remember that with training, our goal is to cause the body to make adaptations. So we may have somebody lift weights, so we're providing a resistance training stimulus, and the idea with that resistance training stimulus is we're trying to cause the muscles to grow, so we're trying to induce hypertrophy, we're trying to cause the muscles or the neuromuscular system more accurately to be able to generate more force, more power. If we're doing endurance exercise, we are inducing some sort of an endurance stimulus, running, cycling, etc., and we're trying to produce higher blood volume, we're trying to produce higher aerobic capacity by causing changes in the heart, more extensible left ventricle, stronger left ventricle, that kind of stuff, right? So in order to cause the body to make adaptations, we have to overload it. So we have to make the body work harder than it's used to working. And so ideally that's going to be a progressive overload. So meaning that we make the body work a little bit harder than it's used to working, and then it'll adapt, and then we do the same thing, and then it'll adapt, and then we do the same thing, and on down, right? So that's that concept of progressive overload. If the overload doesn't progress, so if we provide an initial overload stimulus and then just keep the load the same, what we end up doing then is the body's going to make an initial adaptation, but because the stimulus hasn't changed, the body's not going to continue to adapt, and so we just kind of plateau. Conversely, if we provide this huge overload stimulus, we make the body work way harder than it's used to working, we're going to overload it, but potentially we're going to cause maladaptations, right? Potentially we're going to cause injury, so maybe stress fractures, maybe muscle strains, psychological burnout, those kinds of things. And so in order to induce this progressive overload, there are several variables that we can manipulate to continue to cause the body to work harder than it's used to working, and then cause the body to adapt. So the way those variables are grouped, or the different types of variables that you can manipulate, include things like the volume of training. So the volume, of course, is just how much are you doing. The easiest way to conceptualize this is as the number of sets and reps. So your volume of training in the weight room, if you're doing 3 sets of 10, your total volume of training is 30 repetitions. That's kind of the easiest way to conceptualize that. Another way to think about it is if you're an endurance athlete, how much distance are you covering? So that might be a way of looking at that. How long did you train? So maybe you have them do a 30-minute easy run, something like that. And so maybe they didn't quantify the distance that they ran. Maybe instead they quantified the duration of training. So there's a number of different ways of looking at the total volume of training, how long you've been training, how much work did you put in. And here I'm not using work in a physiological sense, so disregard that. Other things we can manipulate, not only how much are you training, but how hard are you working? And of course, that's the intensity of the training. So in terms of the weight room, the intensity of the training, the easiest way to conceptualize that is how much weight are you lifting? So if you are lifting 50% of your 1 rep max, your 1 rep max being the most amount of weight that you could possibly lift, right? It's your max weight. If you're lifting 50% of that, it's not a very high intensity. If you're lifting 95% of that, that's a pretty high intensity, right? And so that's one way to quantify that in the weight room. Other ways that we can quantify that, velocity. So how fast are you running? How fast are you moving? How fast are you moving the weight? Because that's one thing, again, to go back to the weight room, one of the things that we'll manipulate is we'll ask the athlete to move really fast. Maybe we'll use a light weight, it's 40% of the 1 rep max, but we'll ask them to move that as fast as possible. And so because of that combination of velocity and load, weight lifted in that case, then they're going to have a fairly high intensity movement there, or fairly high intensity set there. Another way that can be quantified, power output. So usually that's in wattage. You probably discussed that some if you've had XPhys already, or if you haven't, you will discuss it in XPhys. So wattage is one way to measure power output. If you're the type of person that likes exercise machines, like I do, most of them have a wattage function on them. So for example, like exercise bikes, rowers, ski ergs. Sometimes you'll see it on treadmills. stair mills, those kinds of things, those are measures of power output. You'll see wattage on those. And so you can look for guidelines on certain wattage numbers that I was going to say coordinate, but I guess that'll work. Certain wattage numbers that equate to particular intensities. So, high intensity, moderate intensity, that kind of stuff. So that's intensity. And then frequency is how often do you train, is probably the easiest way to think about that. So do you have 6 training sessions a week? Do you have 3? Do you have 12? That's the frequency of training. So how many training sessions per week? So volume, how much? Intensity, how hard? And frequency, how many? That's kind of the way that I would think about those in the most straightforward manner. Now, one of the things that I mentioned previously that drives me crazy about this book, not just in isolation, so I mentioned talking about periodization that particularly early on, when periodization first became fairly popular in the U.S., coaches talked about that it was too complicated because there's a lot of terminology and the terminology was confusing and all of that. And so in the context of this textbook and this class, I mentioned that some of the original periodization literature in the U.S. used the Russian terminology. And so they talked about macrocycles, mesocycles, and microcycles, which is the way that I learned it. And in the Bompa and Half or Bompa and Buzzicelli books, that terminology changes some. So rather than saying macrocycle, for Bompa, that's an annual plan. But he keeps the term macrocycle and he uses that instead of mesocycle, and then he uses microcycle in the same way. So of course it's confusing because the terminology moves around. Well, the reason I mention that is because the terminology is about to move around. So again, volume is how much, right? And so, like I said, in the weight room, volume is number of repetitions. And so if we multiply sets times reps, again, that's 30 repetitions, 50 repetitions, whatever it is. That gives you the volume of training. How much distance did you cover? You ran 8 repetitions of 100-meter dash. You covered 800 meters, right? So that's the distance that you covered. And the reason that I mention that it's problematic here is because one of the things that Bompa talks about is tonnage as a measure of volume, right? And so tonnage is the combination, or not the sum, the product of, that's multiplication, the product of sets times reps times load, right? So it is, you did 3 sets of 10 repetitions at 100 pounds. And so that's the tonnage that you lifted. The problem is that if we account for both intensity, because that's what load is, if we count for both load the way he's using it there, if we count for the intensity of the weight of the stimulus, so how much weight did you lift, plus sets and reps, that's actually load the way that we discussed it in a previous lecture. So that is your training load, is how much weight did you lift and then how many times did you lift it. That's your training load. But in this particular chapter, he's using that as volume. So let's just try to stay consistent, and let's say that volume is how much did you do, so it's just number of repetitions, okay? That's probably the easiest way for us to conceptualize that in this class. Load is intensity and volume. And it actually includes frequency as well, so the number of sessions per week if we're looking at a total microcycle. So for us, for right now, for simplicity's sake, let's say that volume is repetitions or distance. And then we're going to say intensity is how much weight did you lift, how hard were you working, right? Like how fast did you run, what was your power output, that kind of stuff. Other things on there, so ground contacts. So ground contacts we use in plyometrics. So if somebody's doing like the speed ladder where they're doing like 1-leg hops, 2-leg hops, they're jumping on boxes. So now I've introduced another type of plyometric exercise. If they're doing rocket jumps, where you just jump as high as you can, jump lunges or scissor jumps, those are called different things. Any kind of jumping type exercise where there is a really rapid stretch and rapid contraction, that's a plyometric exercise. The way that we quantify those is typically number of ground contacts. And those you want to keep close tabs on, because plyometric exercises, since there is a rapid stretch of the muscle, there tends to be a fairly large eccentric component. And remember that eccentric contractions cause more damage to the muscle than concentric contractions. And so if they cause more damage, they tend to cause more soreness. So we just have to be really careful about the volume of ground contacts with our plyometric exercises. Those are something you're going to want to start with a fairly low number of ground contacts and then work your way up to higher volumes fairly slowly. Because the gist of it is, if you take an athlete and you're like, all right, you're fairly deconditioned, we're going to do a bunch of jumps today. They are going to be super sore, and potentially if you do enough jumps, you could cause enough muscle damage to trigger rhabdomyolysis, right? And so that would be problematic. So just something to be aware of in your programming. You want the plyometric stuff to come fairly late in the program. So we want that to be certainly later in the preparatory phase, so closer to the season. And you can use plyometrics. They're actually a really good thing to do during the season. But I would just caution against introducing those too early and introducing a really high volume of those too early. And when we get to the 485 class, there are some specific guidelines that the NSCA has laid out in terms of they have to be able to squat a certain amount of their body weight, they have to be able to bench press a certain amount of their body weight, those kinds of things before they even recommend the athlete attempt to do plyometrics, because otherwise they're not going to be able to, if they can't handle their body weight, they probably shouldn't be landing from height, right? So just an aside there about ground contacts. So that's volume. Then the next thing there, continuing with volume. So the ways to increase volume. So we can just add more repetitions. That's an increase in volume. So I mentioned this, I think I mentioned this. I had a phone call this week where I was talking about this, so I don't know if I talked to you guys about it, but the old training progression, so, and I think I mentioned this, in the middle and early part of the 20th century, the way that people were told to progress their programs was you stack the most amount of weight you can lift on the bar 6 times. And then after you've worked with that for a few workouts, you're going to be a little bit stronger, right? You'll have made some adaptations. And so you can now lift the weight 7 times and then train some more 8 times, 9 times, 10 times. And once you could lift that weight 10 times, the recommendation was to add more weight, so to increase the intensity, and then you drop the volume, so you drop back down to 6 repetitions. So what we're doing there, that was the initial thing, is an increase in volume. So as you add repetitions, you move from 6 to 7 to 8 to 9, you're increasing the volume of training there. So you can add repetitions. A more common way, especially like early in a training program, is that you'll have an athlete do, you know, if you take somebody that's completely deconditioned, maybe you have them do like 1 set of 10 or 2 sets of 10 of body weight exercises. They're probably going to be pretty sore if they're completely deconditioned. And then the next week we have them do 3 sets of 10 instead of 2, right? So that's an increase in the volume of their training. Other things we can do, we can increase the volume within a session, which is actually kind of what I was describing there. So we're just adding sets, and by adding sets, we're adding repetitions. And then the top bullet is that you can increase the frequency of training, meaning that you can train more times per day. So for example, one of the things that weightlifters at least used to do, I haven't kept up a ton with contemporary weightlifter training, so Olympic weightlifters I'm talking about here, is they would do 1 session in the morning, 1 session in the afternoon. And this was especially true of some of the Soviet bloc countries, where they would do fairly high intensity stuff on the snatch in a morning session and then take a break most of the day. And then they'd come back in the evening and do fairly high intensity stuff on the clean. Or they would do lower intensity but higher volume type stuff, so more repetitions on like a front squat or something like that. So they would break their training up into multiple sessions. And so over the course of multiple sessions, you're getting in more total repetitions, and so by doing that, you're increasing the volume of training. So as I mentioned last time, a typical relationship, or the typical relationship between intensity and volume, is inverse. So usually as intensity increases, volume decreases, right? And so using my classic step loading example that I talked about last time, is typically as you increase the intensity, so as we move up from, let's say, so we're doing 10 repetitions, so we do that for a few weeks, and then in 3-4 weeks, we drop down to 8 repetitions. Well, the reason we've dropped from 10 to 8 is because we've increased the weight. And so as we increase the weight, we have thus increased intensity. And so as the intensity increases, then the volume decreases. So typically the relationship between the two is inverse. So we're lifting heavier weights. Sorry about the dog jingling in the back. We're lifting heavier weights. But as we're lifting heavier weights, we're not going to be able to do as many repetitions, so the volume is going to drop. So typically the relationship between the two is inverse. Now that said, if we're doing total training load, and remember that training load is going to incorporate both intensity and volume, the total load of the training is going to go up because they're probably lifting more total weight. If we're looking at tonnage as our measure there. But the typical relationship, like I said, between intensity and volume is inverse. As intensity goes up, volume goes down. And that said, so this isn't particular to this diagram, but that said, remember that's not always true. So we talked about things like flat loading last time, where you have fairly high loads for several weeks. So that's, again, that combination of intensity and volume. But you'll have fairly flat loads, high intensity, high volume for several weeks, and then you will do a deload for 1 to 2 weeks, and then potentially another flat loading cycle. And again, that's something we would use with advanced athletes. But the relationship with the two isn't always inverse, but oftentimes it is. All right, so intensity. Ways to quantify that. So as you can see, there's the qualitative component of work. So how hard are you working? So the power output there, a way to quantify that is power output. So again, weight lifted, running speed, velocity of movement. So how fast is the bar moving would be a way of looking at that. And so one of the ways that they quantify intensity here is different zones, so percentage of your maximum. So an easy way to think about this is with strength training. So this stuff right here, so that is your 1 rep max. That's the most amount of weight you can lift one time. That's your 100%, right? And so if you're lifting 80% of your 1 rep max, they're calling that heavy. And so if you're lifting 80%, a good signpost, I guess, is you can probably lift 80% of your 1 rep max somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 times. Maybe more, maybe one more, maybe one less, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 times. In the 70% range, you're probably more around like 8 times. 60% is probably more around 10 times, and then 50% is kind of in that like 12 to 15 range. So that's how it would correspond with what they're calling maximum heavy, medium heavy, etc. So that's a way to quantify these things. Another way that they do it, in this text anyway, is based on the amount of time you're able to work at your maximum. So if you're like all out sprinting for less than 6 seconds, of course, that is the ATP phosphocreatine system, and that is your absolute maximum intensity. It's the fastest you can run, and you can only maintain that pace, again, for somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10 seconds, because then you're going to deplete your phosphocreatine system. So they're calling that maximal exercise, or zone 1. For them, zone 2, high intensity, so somewhere between 6 and 30 seconds. So now we're getting into the glycolytic system, which is, so you're using ATP phosphocreatine and glycolysis, so all the anaerobic sources. And then once we switch here, so these two are pretty closely related. These are both the glycolytic system, right? So this is ATP phosphocreatine glycolytic. This one's the same thing, but the aerobic side is starting to ramp up a little bit, so there's a little bit more of an aerobic component if we're longer than 30 seconds. Just a bit about the terminology here, because you're going to see this in other textbooks too, and it was something that confused me a ton when I was first learning this stuff. So sometimes you'll see fast glycolysis and slow glycolysis, or you'll see anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic glycolysis. Those are confusing because glycolysis itself is always anaerobic, right? And so what they're meaning with fast glycolysis is that all of those hydrogens that are produced during glycolysis, during those 10 steps, all those hydrogens are getting dropped onto pyruvate and we're making lactate. As opposed to slow glycolysis, again, glycolysis itself, still always anaerobic, but because the intensity of the exercise has dropped a little bit, we've slowed our running pace, if you will, the aerobic system has a chance to catch up. So while a lot of those hydrogens are getting dropped on the pyruvate, some of them are able to go to the mitochondria and the electron transport chain. So not all of that ATP is coming from completely anaerobic energy production. You're getting some of the breakdown of glucose, you're deriving some ATP aerobically. So that's the distinction that they're making between the two. But I do want you to know, because it is important as a concept, that glycolysis itself is always anaerobic. So hopefully you won't be thrown off by the terms fast and slow glycolysis. Effectively what that means is, again, purely, I already explained it, never mind. I won't explain it a second time, sorry. All right, so slow down a little bit more than that. Now the oxidative system really has a chance to catch up, so if we're working for more than 2 minutes, so we're still doing some glycolysis, but now the aerobic system has started to catch up, so you're able to burn, you're able to produce a higher proportion of the ATPs aerobically. And then as we slow down even more, so now we're into that longer than 3 minutes, you're closer to that 50-50 mix of carbohydrates and fat as you slow down more, and then as your fuel source. Remember, the more you slow down, there's more steps in fat breakdown, so the more you slow down, the higher proportion of that energy comes from fat. And then as we go down here, longer than 30 minutes, that is a lot, it's primarily oxidative, and a lot of that energy comes from fat breakdown. So that's one of the ways to quantify it. I mean, I guess you could do that. I wouldn't do that if I was drawing up a program, but that's a way to quantify intensities. A more common way and a better way is to look at heart rate, right? So we're going to do the most straightforward version of heart rate, and probably what is still the most common version of heart rate, and that is to look at percentage of maximum. So it's the same concept as percentage of 1 rep max, like when we talk about lifting weights. So what you have to do is find somebody's max heart rate. And the most effective way to find somebody's max heart rate is to have them do maximal exercise. You put them on a treadmill, have them run really hard for a relatively long period of time, and we see how high we can get their heart rate to determine what their max heart rate is. If you don't have the ability to do that, and most of the time we don't, the easiest way to estimate is to take, oh, sorry, my slide's wrong. I should fix that. 220, so 220 minus their age. So like I said, disregard that slide. I'll have to go through and fix it on the slideshow in Canvas, but it is 220 minus your age. And then, so that's the most common way. So if you're a 20-year-old, then your max heart rate is 200, right? So 220 minus your age, 220 minus 20 is 200, so your max heart rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 220, or sorry, 200, man. It's 200 if you're 20 years old. But it is in that neighborhood. So you do get some variability, so it can be 10% higher, it can be 10% less. So for me, that equation has usually been pretty close to being accurate, but for somebody like my wife, who is very small, I joke that she's a hummingbird because she is like 4'11", and her max heart rate is at least 10% higher than that equation would estimate. So, but it gives you a good ballpark. Another way to do it is 208 minus 0.7 times your age. So take whatever your age is, let's say 20, multiply that by 0.7, whatever that gives you, subtract that from 208, and that'll give you another estimate of max heart rate as well. And so what we can do then is we can have our athletes working at a certain percentage of their max heart rate. So you can see this one comes from the Australian Institute for Sport. And so the way they've done it for their cyclists is to have really easy training, or recovery training is less than 75% of your max heart rate. So if you're a 20-year-old, again, your max heart rate would be somewhere around 200. Multiply that by 0.75. And so then that gives you anything below that is recovery pace. between 75 and 85% of your max heart rate is comfortable. 85 to 92% is uncomfortable. So there's a part of a book that I'll scan. The book is called Jack Daniel's Running Formula. It's not whiskey. He's a cross-country coach. He's an exercise physiologist as well. And he was at one of the State University of New York schools for a long time. I forget which one. Doesn't matter. But anyway, if you're into endurance training, it's a really, really good book. It's a really easy program to use. But one of the intensities that he talks about is interval pace. And so for him, interval pace is pretty much similar to this, where for him it's actually 88 to 92% of your max heart rate. But the idea there is that you do these sustained runs of like 20 to 40 minutes, take a small break between of like 10 minutes of running at a much slower pace, and then you do it again, right? And so that would be here, kind of in this range. And then if we're going above 92% of our max heart rate, they call that stressful. In the Jack Daniels book, that would be repetition training. So it's more of a sprint type training to work on your running economy in that case. So heart rate's a really good way to go about quantifying the intensity of a program. So one of the ways this can be used from a practical standpoint, we can use it, like I said, for repetition training, interval training with our endurance athletes. We can also use it for making sure they're not working too hard. Because actually what tends to happen, so I've used this example before, where if we have somebody who is training for like a 10K or a half marathon, sometimes people will just go out and run, like, okay, today I'm gonna run 1 mile, next time I'll run 2, next time I'll run 3, that kind of thing. But the intensity of the workout is always the same. Basically, they end up being kind of in this zone. So usually they're more in that 75-ish% of their max heart rate. And so they never make the adaptations, they never recruit the muscle fibers like your many of the type 2As and none of the type 2Xs that they would recruit if they're down here. So you don't maximize adaptations, but you actually work out a little bit too hard to recover. So one of the things that we can do with our heart rate monitoring is to make sure that the athletes aren't working too hard during what should be rest workouts as well. So it's actually pretty useful for that. If we're having athletes do repeated sprints, what we may do, rather than doing like defined rest intervals, so rather than saying, okay, you're going to sprint for 30 seconds and rest for 90, what we may have them do is say, okay, we're going to sprint for 30 seconds, and then we're going to wait until your heart rate is below 75% of your max heart rate, and then you're going to start the next one. So we measure recovery that way rather than based on absolute time intervals. And so as an aside here, in talking about max heart rate, one of the things that you're probably familiar with is the idea that you're supposed to get 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise most days of the week. But one of the things that almost nobody knows is what that means. So moderate intensity is correlated to, or not correlated to, it is pegged to certain heart rates. So for moderate intensity physical activity, for both the American College of Sports Medicine and the CDC, moderate intensity means 65% to 75% of your heart rate max. And so why I mention that is that oftentimes people will be like, oh yeah, I totally get 150 minutes a week of activity, but very rarely do they get their heart rate up to 65% of their max. So usually if somebody says, oh yeah, I do 150 minutes a week, I walk, maybe I walk the dog or something like that. That tends to be a pretty leisurely pace. That's actually light exercise for most people. So just something to be aware of there. So you can see my little chart here. So if you are 20 years old, moderate intensity is a heart rate somewhere between 124 and 147, and then vigorous is more than 147 beats per minute. So why that matters is if you get vigorous physical activity, so greater than 76% of your max heart rate, you only need half as much. So every minute of vigorous exercise counts as 2 of moderate intensity. So running is more efficient than walking to hit those guidelines. And if you do hit those guidelines, hitting those recommendations results in a 25% drop in all-cause mortality. So basically 1/4 reduction in your risk of dying from anything. Hitting those recommendations also lowers your risk of heart disease, lowers your risk of stroke, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, dementia, and several types of cancer. People who hit those recommendations tend to have better sleep quality, lower risk of sleep apnea, improved memory, improved attention, improved processing speed, better bone health, and then fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety. So obviously exercise is good for you, but you want to make sure it is sufficiently intense so that you actually do hit the recommendations. And as mentioned, almost no one does. But so this is what those numbers look like. There's another way of measuring those as well, which is called METs. METs are metabolic equivalents. Those, you don't see many exercise machines that have METs on them anymore. The older ones did. And then if you go like to a clinical exercise physiology facility, they will. But METs are how many times your resting metabolism you're working. And so 3 to 6 METs is moderate intensity exercise, and then anything above 6 METs is vigorous. But if you've ever used METs, you don't have to be working very, very hard to hit vigorous. So I would use heart rate max as my determiner. And here's a handy little handout from the ACSM about monitoring the intensity of your exercise. And so this is obviously on the slideshow as well if you want to spend a little more time looking at it. All right, so as mentioned, the relationship between volume and intensity are typically, but not always, an inverse relationship. And so we can quantify the relationship between the two. So, and it's not actually on this slide, and as I'm thinking about it, but the relationship between volume, intensity, and then frequency is your total training load. So how much in terms of how many repetitions, how hard, and then how often. How much, how hard, how often, right? So how much being volume, how hard being intensity, and how often being the frequency. And so the combination of those three things then is your total training load. And I mention that too because you hear people talk about in strength and conditioning now, like in all things really, you know, we're in this era of data analytics and quantification. And so in the strength and conditioning world, one of the ways that training load is quantified is they'll put a little GPS pack, you know, if you watch like Australian rugby, or you watch, I think I've seen it in Premier League too, where they have a little GPS pack in the back of their shirts, on the back of their jerseys. And so again, what those do is they quantify how many miles the players run. They quantify, or they quantify running speed, changes of direction, all that kind of stuff, and then that adds up to what is a total training load of that particular bout or of that particular game. So how far did they run, how fast did they run is kind of what they're looking at there. And then if you look across the course of the week, if we add that up across multiple sessions, so not only the game but also the practice sessions, that gives you the load for the week. And so that's one of the big, like, in vogue things that is being quantified in strength and conditioning is using some of those GPS systems to do that. I was going to say something else about that and I forgot. All right, anyway, so different ways to quantify load. So again, distance covered, strategies for altering volumes. We've talked about some of this stuff. So you can increase the length of the session. So by increasing the length of the training session, they're probably running longer, right? They're running farther. Increase the frequency of the training, sets, reps, drills per session. Increase the distance traveled per repetition. So rather than running hundreds, you run 200s. That's an increase in volume. And then strategies for altering the intensity of the training. So they can run faster. Increase power output. So again, if you had a machine that had wattage, so again, like an exercise bike or rower, et cetera, you can tell them, hey, I want you to maintain a pace above 175 watts. That would be one of the ways that you could have them work at a high intensity. Again, the easy way to do it in terms of the weight room is increase the weight. And another way to do it in the weight room is just increase the speed of movement. So increase the velocity there. You can also decrease the rest intervals. So rather than having it be, 1 work to 3 rest, so they run for 30 seconds, they rest for 90, you could do 1 to 2. Run for 30 seconds, rest for 60. One of the really popular training protocols used for like high intensity interval training, it is 20 seconds of rest, 20 seconds of work, 10 seconds of rest. So it is 2 to 1 work to rest ratio, and those are going to be really hard. They're not going to be able to get very many repetitions because of the low rest intervals there. So that increases the intensity of the training, right? Performing a higher percentage of your heart rate max, and then increase the number of competitions. So obviously, one of the things this book talks about a lot, and you hear coaches talk about this as well, is that you want the training, you want the practice to be harder than the competition. But of course, that's never the way it works, right? In the same way that intensity is pretty high during competitions, but it's always especially high during the playoffs. Like everybody finds an extra gear during the playoffs, and so in the same way that the regular season can never match the intensity of the postseason, your training is never really going to match the intensity of a competition. So one of the ways that you can alter the intensity of the training is to add more competitions in there, because you're always going to run faster on race day than you did in training, right? Almost always. So three factors that affect the intensity used in the training. The characteristics of the sport. So a lot of our sports that we're going to train athletes for would be considered high intensity because they rely primarily on anaerobic metabolism. So things like basketball, football, soccer, hockey, lacrosse, etc. Because those are interval sprint sports, or in the case of football, for a lot of positions in American football, those are just sprint power sports, right? So because they're sprint power sports, we're going to do sprint power training. It doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a bunch of time doing low intensity training if the characteristics of the sport are such that it is strength power. Why wouldn't we train that? Other things that affect intensity, so the training or the competitive environment. So ways to increase intensity from a training environment standpoint, you could add some heat, as we talked about last time. You could add hills, right? So that's obviously harder than running over flat land. You could add sand or have them perform in the sand. If they normally draft, so if we're talking about runners on a track or cyclists one behind another, you could have them not do that to increase the intensity, because now they're having to break through that air themselves. They're not being able to be pulled along by the vacuum created by the person in front of them. And then the athlete's performance level. So one of the things that the book talks about is that medium intensity for an elite athlete would be super maximal for a novice. So for example, I have a pretty sweet exercise bike in the basement. And so like best case, I'm maintaining a pace of about, I can knock out 18 miles in an hour, which I'm working pretty hard to do that. During the flat sections of the Tour de France, they average 28 miles an hour. So for me, 18 miles an hour is pretty good. For an athlete, an elite athlete, an elite cyclist in the Tour de France, that would actually be a detraining load. Like that's pretty slow. And the same kind of thing if you ever are out there running and you look at how fast you're running, your minutes per mile pace, and then you think about how fast elite marathoners run, where they're running 5:45 for 26 miles. That may be 5 miles an hour or more faster than a lot of us run during a normal run. So what they run for their training would be way more than most of us novice athletes could do. And at the same time, if they did what would be a fairly difficult workout for me, that would actually probably be a detraining stimulus for them. So how hard an athlete works is dependent upon their preparation, their level. So again, this is some of the same kind of stuff. So you got to induce progressive overload in order to continue to foster adaptations. To foster continued adaptations, you have to have additional progressive overload. So the frequency of training, also known as the density. So again, the easiest way to conceptualize this is the number of training sessions per week. And so this is another section of this particular book where the terms have moved around. So in the frequency section of this chapter, if you happen to read the chapter, they talk about sessions per week. Fine, it's a totally easy thing to understand. But then they go on to talk about work-rest ratios, Well, work-rest ratios are intensity, and I think their table's messed up because if you're sprinting, I don't think you're going to have that long of a rest interval. Possibly, you do want sufficient recovery, but that seems to be a little bit on the long side. Those are some of the longer ones I've seen. So anyway, and I didn't notice that till I was preparing for this lecture. But just be aware that altering the work-rest ratios is a function of, or you're affecting the intensity, not the frequency of the workout. So again, frequency, just know that's the number of sessions per week. If they're doing multiple sessions per day, one thing from a practical standpoint to keep in mind is that you're probably gonna have to change the focus of training per session. So for example, maybe in the morning when they're fresh, you're gonna do some high intensity stuff. You're gonna have them do lots of sprinting, lots of jumping, that kind of stuff. And then in the afternoon session, you could do more endurance-based, so lower intensity, longer duration, depending on your training outcomes you're going for. Or oftentimes those will be strategic sessions. So if you're familiar with like preseason camps for football, and I would imagine it's similar for your other sports, where they'll do a really hard, like full practice with full team stuff first thing in the morning for, 2 hours. And then the afternoon session, even though there is a second quote unquote practice, usually the afternoon session is like special teams and some level of a walkthrough. It's a lot more like working on the tactical aspects of the sport rather than doing much technical or physiological conditioning type stuff. So they do offer, and again, this is another one where the terminology has moved around some. So they talk about calculating the density of a training session, and they group that under frequency. Well, the way they calculate the density of a training session, so the example they give in the book is that the athlete has worked for 102 minutes. So they're probably it's probably an endurance athlete doing the interval type training that I described to you earlier, the Jack Daniels type, where they're somewhere between like 85, maybe 92% of their heart rate, probably closer to 85% of their max heart rate. And they're working for 30 minutes per time, 3 sets of 30 minutes. And then they had 26 minutes worth of rest intervals in between. And so you multiply that by 100, divide by 102, which was their absolute volume. That was their work volume, and that gives you 74.5%, which if we go back to that chart that I showed you earlier, that I was talking about, percentage of 1 rep max, that at 80%, you can do sets of 5, 70%, somewhere in the 8 repetitions range. They actually, after calculating that, go back to this chart and they say, well, then that's somewhere in the medium heavy range. Which I think, in my opinion, that is quantification for the sake of quantification. That's putting a number on something to say you put a number on it and to make it seem precise. So I don't think calculating absolute density the way they do here, I don't think it makes any sense. Like I said, I think it produces a number so you can give somebody a number and say, oh, well, today we worked at medium heavy intensity. But I don't think that that's a useful thing to do. So that said, that's another one of my little soapbox asides, is I think a lot of the data analysis stuff, not all of it certainly, a lot of it is quite useful, but I think there is a lot of like numbers for the sake of numbers, which is exactly what I think this is. And because there's a number, it gives you this impression that it's precise. You measured something, it's 74.5. That's even a decimal. That's a really specific number. And so I think it gives you this false impression of precision. Which I find problematic. But the other thing I find problematic here, of course, is that because we looked at work volume and rest volume, what we're actually looking at here is not frequency of training. We're not looking at the number of sessions. We're looking at training load. So again, they've shifted the terms around some. So that absolute density, where they're calling density frequency, that density is training load. So again, it's moved around some. So like I said, just for the sake of simplicity, if we're looking at volume, training volume, how much? Again, repetitions. If we're looking at intensity, how hard? So percentage of max, whether it's heart rate max or 1 rep max. And then frequency is how many times a week you train it. Okay, so how much, how hard, how many? Those are the ways that we want to think about that. We'll talk about load and we'll calculate load, but just be wary as you're going through this stuff of the way that the terms move around. And like I said, if you go to a strength and conditioning conference, you're going to see the same thing. I think a lot of the stuff that appears confusing, like I said, is unnecessarily so because of the inconsistency with the terminology. So I wish people would do a better job of defining their terms at the outset. This is what frequency is, this is what volume is, this is what intensity is, and then stick with those things. But unfortunately, a lot of times, certainly in strength and conditioning literature, that doesn't happen. And so I think it leads to unnecessary confusion, which is kind of what's happened here. All right, enough of that little rant. Last thing there, the more complex the skill, complexity is related to intensity. So the more complex the skill, the more it's going to induce a higher heart rate, more lactate accumulation. So obviously with Simone Biles there on the uneven bars, that's a pretty complex skill to be able to spin and catch and all of that stuff. And so with that complexity of having to do multiple different athletic movements, then that is going to be a higher intensity skill. All right, so that's all I got for you for chapter 4. So like I said, it's all the material for the first test, so good luck on that. And then we will move on to the next section of the textbook in chapter 5, so we'll see you for that.